Hello and welcome. I'm glad you have found your way here tonight. We're about to journey back to the blood and sand of ancient Rome. But our story does not take place in the Grand Colosseum. It takes place in the brutal training grounds that forged the men who fought there. This story is designed simply for calm and for rest. There is no need to follow every word. Feel free to let your mind drift and to fall asleep whenever you are ready. Find your most comfortable position. Close your eyes and listen to the sounds of a life of brutal discipline. Our journey tonight takes us into a Roman gladiator school, a ludus. We will explore the crushing reality of a gladiator's daily life, a world of pain, fear, and relentless training. So rest now and listen. Our story begins not in the arena, but in the grim, sun-baked courtyard of a gladiator school in Capua. Let us call our man Lyros. He is not a volunteer seeking glory. He is a captured Thracian warrior, sold into this life after his rebellion was crushed by the legions. He stands in a line with other new arrivals, prisoners of war, condemned criminals, and desperate men who have sold themselves into servitude, all of them now the property of the school's owner, the lanista. The air in the courtyard is thick with the smell of sweat, stale straw, blood, and a pervasive underlying scent of fear. The sounds are of the rhythmic crash of wooden swords against shields from the training grounds, the sharp crack of a whip, and the low guttural shouts of the trainers, the doctors. This is not a place of honor. It is a prison where men are turned into weapons for public entertainment. The lanista, a wealthy and ruthless businessman, inspects his new purchases. He walks down the line of men, his gaze cold and calculating. He is not looking for courage or spirit. He is assessing their physical attributes as one would assess livestock. He checks Lyros's height, the breadth of his shoulders, the strength of his legs. He feels his arms testing the muscle. He sees the defiance in Lyros's eyes and smiles, a cruel, thin smile. A rebellious spirit, he knows, makes for a good fighter if it can be properly broken and reshaped. After the inspection, Lyros's old life is systematically erased. His name is taken from him. He is now simply the Thracian, a label that defines his fighting style. His ragged clothes are stripped from him and burned. He is given a simple, rough loincloth, the sublegaculum, the uniform of the trainee. His hair is shorn, and he is branded on his arm with the mark of the school, a permanent sign that he is no longer a man but property, an infamous, the lowest of the low in Roman society. He is then thrown into his new home, a cella, a small, dark, and filthy cell, barely large enough for a single man to lie down. The floor is packed earth, the walls are damp stone, and a single, high, barred window lets in a sliver of light but no hope. He shares this space with another man, a grim, silent criminal, condemned to the arena. There is no comfort here, only the hard floor, a single coarse blanket, and the constant presence of despair. The first day of training is designed to shock and to break. There are no weapons yet. It is a day of pure, brutal physical conditioning. The recruits are forced to run for hours in the soft, energy-sapping sand of the training yard under the punishing sun. They are made to lift heavy stones, to jump, to perform endless exercises that push their bodies to the point of collapse. Any man who falters, who slows down, is immediately met with the sharp, stinging crack of a trainer's whip across his back. The pain is a constant teacher. Lyros, though a warrior and in excellent physical condition, finds himself pushed to his absolute limit. His lungs burn, his muscles scream, and his body is drenched in sweat. Learns that his previous life of freedom and combat meant nothing here. He was now an animal, being conditioned to perform. The days of pure brutal conditioning bleed into one another, a blur of running, lifting, and pain. The initial defiance in the recruits' eyes is slowly replaced by a dull, weary resignation. Their bodies, pushed beyond their limits, begin to change. They become leaner, harder, the soft flesh of their previous lives stripped away, replaced by the dense, functional muscle required for survival in the ludus. Another crucial aspect of this transformation is the diet. The food they are given is not the nourishing, protein-rich fare one might expect for athletes. It is the infamous sagna gladiatorum, the gladiator's mash. It is a thick, heavy porridge made primarily from barley and beans, sometimes supplemented with dried fruit. It is a high-carbohydrate, fattening diet, and it is served to them in large, unappetizing heaps. The purpose of this diet is a grim and practical one. It is designed to build a thick layer of subcutaneous fat over their muscles. This layer of fat serves a morbidly theatrical purpose. Protects the gladiator from superficial cuts, allowing him to sustain multiple, bloody-looking but non-lethal wounds during a fight. A long, bloody spectacle was far more entertaining for the crowd than a quick, clean kill. The fat also helped to cushion the nerves and organs from deeper, more serious blows. They were being fattened like prize pigs, their bodies cultivated for the most dramatic slaughter possible. After weeks of this relentless physical and dietary conditioning, the day finally comes when the recruits are introduced to their weapons. They are led to the armory, a dark, intimidating room that smells of old sweat, oiled leather, and cold iron. But they are not given real steel. They are issued arma lusoria, training weapons. Swords are made of heavy, dense wood, and the shields are made of wicker and leather. Crucially, they are all deliberately crafted to be twice the weight of the real things. The lanista and his trainers, the doctors, now begin the process of assigning each recruit to a specific gladiator class. They assess each man's physique, his natural agility, his strength, and his temperament. A large, powerful man might be destined to become a murmillo with his large shield and sword. A smaller, faster man might be trained as a retiarius with a net and trident. For Lyros, a captured Thracian warrior, the choice is obvious. He will be trained as a Threx, a Thracian. He is handed his specific tools of the trade, a heavy wooden version of the Sika, the short, curved Thracian sword, and a small square shield, the Parma. The small shield feels dangerously inadequate in his hands, a stark contrast to the large war shields he was used to. The curved sword feels awkward, its balance completely different from the straight blades of his homeland. His trainer, or doctor, is a grim, heavily scarred former gladiator, himself a Thracian who had survived long enough to earn his freedom. He is a brutal and unforgiving teacher. His first lesson is not in attack, but in stance and footwork. The small Parma offered little in the way of passive defense. Survival as a Threx depended on constant movement, on agility, on dodging and parrying. Alyros spends hours shuffling back and forth across the sand, learning the specific, dance-like footwork required. His heavy training shield feeling like a lead weight on his arm. His doctor watches his every move, his whip a constant whistling presence in the air. A clumsy step, a moment of poor balance, and the whip would lash out, a sharp, stinging reminder of his mistake. Then came the endless drills against the Palus, the wooden training post. Unlike the legionary's simple thrusts, Lyros's training is more complex. The curved sica is designed to hook around an opponent's shield, to strike at the neck or the back of the knee. He must practice these difficult, angled attacks over and over again, his wrist and forearm aching with the unfamiliar strain. He learns that his helmet, a heavy bronze gallia with a distinctive griffin crest, is both a protection and a prison. When he puts it on, his vision is reduced to a narrow slit, and the world becomes a series of muffled, echoing sounds. He must learn to fight in this state of sensory deprivation, to rely on instinct and the feel of his opponent's movements rather than on clear sight. The heat and lack of air inside the helmet are suffocating, and he often ends a training session dizzy and gasping for breath. This is his new reality. A cycle of tasteless, fattening food, of grueling, repetitive drills with impossibly heavy weapons, and of the constant, brutal discipline of the trainers. He is no longer just being broken. He is being systematically deconstructed and rebuilt into a very specific kind of killer, a performer in the theater of death for the entertainment of the Roman mob. The physical toll of the training was immense, but it was the psychological grinding that truly reshaped the men. The ludus was a closed universe, a world with its own brutal laws, its own language of pain and survival, and its own distorted sense of time. The days bled into one another, a monotonous cycle of waking in the dark, eating the same tasteless mash, and spending every sunlit hour in the dusty, blood-flecked sand of the training yard. The yard was never quiet. It was a constant cacophony of sound, the rhythmic, percussive crash of hundreds of wooden swords against shields and training posts, the guttural, roaring shouts of the doctors as they barked their commands, the sharp, stinging crack of a whip, and the low, constant groans of men pushing their bodies to the absolute limit of endurance. There was no peace, no moment for quiet reflection. The noise was another tool, a way to keep the recruits' minds perpetually on edge, to prevent them from thinking too much about their hopeless situation. The trainers, the doctors, were more than just instructors. They were brutal psychologists. They were almost always former gladiators themselves, men who had survived years in the arena, their bodies a roadmap of scars. Their minds honed to a razor's edge of practical combat knowledge. They knew the mechanics of fighting, but they also knew the mechanics of fear. They would watch each recruit, identifying his weaknesses, his fears, and his breaking points, and they would exploit them without mercy. If a man was afraid of pain, he would be beaten more often. If he was clumsy, he would be forced to practice his footwork until he collapsed. If he showed a spark of arrogance, he would be brutally humbled in a sparring match against a superior opponent. It was a calculated, systematic process of breaking down a man's ego, his pride, and his will, and then rebuilding him from the ground up as a creature of pure instinctual violence. After what felt like an eternity of hitting the inanimate Palus, the day came when the recruits were finally allowed to spar against each other. This was a terrifying and significant rite of passage. They were not fighting to the death, but the bouts were far from gentle. They still used the heavy, blunted training weapons, but a blow from a weighted wooden sword could easily break a rib or a jaw. Leros was pitted against a large, brutish German warrior who had been a constant tormentor in the barracks. As they circled each other in the center of the training yard, a ring of other gladiators formed around them, shouting crude encouragement and placing bets on the outcome. The feeling was completely different from hitting the post. His opponent was alive, thinking and trying to hurt him. The fear was a cold, sharp presence in his gut. His first few movements were clumsy, defensive. The German pressed his attack, his heavy blows crashing against Leroy's small Parma shield with a force that sent jarring shocks up his arm. The crowd of gladiators jeered, but then something shifted. The endless hours of drilling, the thousands of repetitive movements, took over, saw an opening. The German, in his haste, swung his sword in a wide, clumsy arc. Leros, without thinking, ducked under the blow, his body moving with a speed and agility he didn't know he possessed. He used the hook of his curved sicca to get around the German S-shield and delivered a sharp, painful blow to the back of his opponent's knee. The big man roared in pain and stumbled. The crowd's jeering turned to a murmur of interest. The fight was over a moment later. Leros had not won through strength, but through the brutal, efficient science that had been beaten into him. The aftermath of these sparring sessions was a strange and cruel paradox. The yard would be littered with men nursing injuries, bruised ribs, split lips, dislocated shoulders. They would be dragged, groaning, to the valetudinarium, the school's infirmary. Here, a different kind of professional took over. The Medici, the doctors employed by the Lanista, were often highly skilled physicians. They would meticulously clean and stitch wounds, expertly set broken bones, and apply soothing salves to bruises. The level of medical care given to a gladiator was often far better than that available to the average Roman citizen. But this care was not born of compassion. The gladiators were an incredibly expensive investment, a stable of prize animals. A skilled doctor was as essential to the Lanista's business as a good trainer. He was there to protect the property. So Leros would find himself in a bizarre routine. In the morning, he would be brutally beaten by his doctor in the training yard. In the afternoon, he would be meticulously patched up by another kind of doctor in the infirmary. It was a surreal cycle of violence and healing, a system designed to keep his body in a perpetual state of readiness for the true purpose of his existence, the arena. He had crossed a new threshold. He had fought a man and won. The taste of it was a mixture of terror and a dark, grim satisfaction. As months of this brutal routine ground on, the initial, chaotic mass of recruits was slowly forged into a hardened, disciplined community. A strange and complex social order began to form within the walls of the ludus. Leros learned that not all gladiators were equal. There was a clear hierarchy based on fighting style, experience, and success in the arena. The established fighters, the veterans who had survived multiple combats, carried themselves with a grim, dangerous confidence. They received better food, better equipment, and the respect of the trainers. The new recruits, the Tyrones, were at the very bottom, subject to the whims and abuse of everyone else. Leros, having proven his competence in the sparring sessions, slowly began to earn a sliver of respect, a small foothold in this brutal new world. Intense rivalries existed between the different classes of gladiators. The heavily armed Myrmilones, with their great shields and swords, looked down on the nimble retieri with their nets and tridents, seeing them as tricksters rather than true warriors. These rivalries were encouraged by the Lanista, as they made for more passionate and entertaining fights in the arena. Yet in this dark and violent world, strange and powerful bonds of friendship could also form. These were the men who shared the same cell, the same food, the same beatings. They understood each other's fears and desperation in a way that no one on the outside ever could. Lyros formed a quiet, unspoken bond with the silent criminal who shared his cell. They would share their meager rations, help each other clean their gear, and stand together against the bullies of the barracks. They knew that one day they might be forced to kill each other in the sand of the arena. But for now, in the shared misery of the ludus, they were brothers. The shadow of the arena loomed over every moment of their existence. Every drill, every meal, every waking hour was a preparation for a moment of public slaughter. This knowledge was a constant heavy weight on the soul. Lyros saw how it affected the men in different ways. Some, like the big German, embraced the violence. They became arrogant and cruel, finding their identity in their ability to dominate others. They were the ones who would likely thrive in the arena.
Ow.
Others fell into a deep, quiet despair. They would go through the motions of training, their eyes vacant and hopeless. These men, Lyros learned, usually did not last long, would either die in their first fight or take their own lives in the darkness of their cells. Lyros chose a third path, a path of quiet, stoic resolve. He focused only on his training, on perfecting his skills, on the simple day-to-day mechanics of survival. He walled off his emotions, his fear, and his memories of his past life. It was the only way to stay sane. Finally, after nearly a year of this relentless process, the lanista deemed him ready. His name was put on the list for the upcoming games. His first public appearance, however, was not the fight itself, but the pampa, the grand parade through the city streets on the day of the games. The gladiators were cleaned, their bodies oiled until they shone. They were dressed in ornate, colorful parade armor, a glittering mockery of their combat gear. The shock of leaving the grim, closed world of the ludus and entering the chaotic, noisy city was overwhelming. The roar of the crowd, the smells of street food and unwashed humanity, the bright sunlight tit was a sensory assault. Lyros marched in the procession, his face a hard, emotionless mask, while the mob cheered and jeered. He felt like an exotic animal being paraded before its slaughter. Wealthy patrons would point them out, placing bets, their faces alight with a morbid, vicarious thrill. The night before the games, the gladiators were given the traditional cena libera, the free feast. It was a strange, surreal event. They were served a lavish banquet, with roasted meats, fine wines, and sweet cakes, all the luxuries that had been denied to them for a year. It was a final, ironic gift from the lanista, a way to fatten them up and give them a taste of what they were about to die for. The atmosphere at the feast was thick with a strange mixture of gallows humor and profound, silent terror. Some men gorged themselves, laughing and boasting, trying to mask their fear with bravado. Others sat in silence, unable to eat, their eyes wide and staring. Lyros ate slowly, methodically, knowing he would need the strength for the morning. He caught the eye of his cellmate across the table, and they shared a single, grim nod. There were no grand farewells. There was nothing left to say. Later, back in his cell, alone in the absolute darkness, Lyros lay on the cold stone floor, the rich food a heavy knot in his stomach. He could still hear the distant sounds of the city, the laughter and the music. A world that he was no longer a part of. He was a gladiator now. His training, his brutal and systematic dehumanization was complete. He had been forged into a weapon, and tomorrow, in the sand of the arena, in front of the roaring mob, he would finally be put to the test. The life of a gladiator trainee at Tyro was a relentless, grinding routine designed to strip away every vestige of his former self and rebuild him as a living weapon. The ludus was a self-contained universe, a machine for producing performers for the bloody theater of the arena. For Lyros, the days and weeks began to blur into a single, monotonous continuum of pain, exhaustion, and the grim, tasteless sustenance that kept him alive. His day began in the cold, absolute blackness of his cell, long before the first hint of dawn. He would be woken not by a horn, but by the harsh, grating sound of an iron bar being dragged along the barred doors of the cells, a sound that would jolt him from a shallow, restless sleep. There was no time for contemplation. The guards would shout crude commands, and the men would stumble from their hard pallets, their bodies already aching in anticipation of the day's torment. The first stop was the latrine, a simple, foul-smelling trench at the edge of the compound. Then came the morning meal, a grim and silent affair. The men would line up with their rough wooden bowls to receive their portion of the sagana gladiatorum. The gladiator's mash was a thick, heavy porridge of boiled barley and beans, sometimes with a few lentils mixed in. It was bland, heavy, and difficult to swallow, but it was calorie-dense. This diet was a deliberate science, was designed to build a thick layer of subcutaneous fat over their hard-won muscles. This layer of fat served a morbidly practical purpose. In the arena, it would protect the gladiator from superficial cuts, allowing him to sustain multiple, bloody-looking but non-lethal wounds. A long, bloody spectacle was far more entertaining for the crowd than a quick, clean kill. The fat also helped to cushion the nerves and organs from deeper, more serious blows. They were being fattened like prize animals, their bodies cultivated for the most dramatic slaughter possible. After the meal, the day's training began. It did not start with weapons. It started with a brutal session of physical conditioning that would last for hours. They were forced to run endless laps in the soft, energy-sapping sand of the training yard, their bare feet sinking, their lungs burning. They would then move on to lifting heavy stones, their backs straining, their muscles screaming. The trainers, the doctors, would push them relentlessly. They were made to jump, to climb ropes, to perform endless series of squats and lunges. The goal was to build not just strength, but a deep, seemingly bottomless well of stamina. A gladiator who tired in the arena was a dead gladiator. Any man who faltered, who slowed his pace, was immediately met with the sharp, stinging crack of a trainer's whip across his back. The pain was a constant teacher, a brutal motivator. This was not just physical exertion, it was a form of psychological warfare. The trainers would heap verbal abuse on the recruits, calling them weak, pathetic, and worthless. They were being systematically broken down, their individual pride and willpower eroded, until all that remained was a grim, reflexive obedience. Only after this initial, exhausting ordeal were they allowed to pick up their training weapons. The arma lusoria were a cruel joke. The swords were made of heavy, dense wood, and the shields were made of wicker and leather. But they were all deliberately crafted to be twice the weight of the real things. The theory was that after months of training with these impossibly heavy tools, the real weapons would feel as light as a feather in their hands. The lanista and his trainers would then begin the process of assigning each recruit to a specific gladiator class. They assessed each man's physique, his natural agility, his strength, and his temperament. For Lyros, a captured Thracian warrior, the choice was obvious. He would be trained as a Threx, a Thracian, a fighting style that was a stylized and deadly parody of his own people's way of war. He is handed his specific tools of the trade, a heavy wooden version of the Seca. It's a short, curved Thracian sword and a small square shield, the Parma. The small shield feels dangerously inadequate in his hands, a stark contrast to the large war shields he was used to. The curved sword feels awkward, its balance completely different from the straight blades of his homeland. His trainer, or doctor, is a grim, heavily scarred former gladiator, himself a Thracian, who had survived long enough to earn his freedom and a position of authority in the ludus. He is a brutal and unforgiving teacher. His first lesson is not in attack, but in stance and footwork. The small Parma offered little in the way of passive defense. Survival as a Threx depended on constant movement, on agility, on dodging and parrying. Lyros spends hours shuffling back and forth across the sand, learning the specific dance-like footwork required. His heavy training shield feeling like a lead weight on his arm. His doctor watches his every move, his whip a constant, whistling presence in the air. A clumsy step, a moment of poor balance, and the whip would lash out, a sharp, stinging reminder of his mistake. Then came the endless drills against the palace, the wooden training post. Unlike the legionaries' simple thrusts, Lyros' training is more complex. The curved Sika is designed to hook around an opponent's shield to strike at the neck or the back of the knee. He must practice these difficult angled attacks over and over again, his wrist and forearm aching with the unfamiliar strain. He learns that his helmet, a heavy bronze gallia with a distinctive griffin crest, is both a protection and a prison. When he puts it on, his vision is reduced to a narrow slit, and the world becomes a series of muffled, echoing sounds. He must learn to fight in this state of sensory deprivation, to rely on instinct and the feel of his opponent's movements rather than on clear sight. The heat and lack of air inside the helmet are suffocating, and he often ends a training session dizzy and gasping for breath. This is his new reality. A cycle of tasteless, fattening food, of grueling, repetitive drills with impossibly heavy weapons, and of the constant brutal discipline of the trainers. He is no longer just being broken. He's being systematically deconstructed and rebuilt into a very specific kind of killer, a performer in the theater of death for the entertainment of the Roman mob. The doctor is a master of his craft. He demonstrates the unique movements of the Threx with a deadly grace that belies his age and his scarred body. He shows Lyros how to use the small Parma not as a wall, but as a dynamic tool. To deflect a blow and immediately use the shield's edge in a counterstrike. He teaches him to be constantly moving, to never present a static target, to be a whirlwind of defensive and offensive motion. The training against the Palus becomes more complex. It is no longer just about striking. It is about rhythm, about flow. The doctor will call out a sequence of moves. Parry high. Lunge low. Hook behind. Step back. Lyros must perform the sequence flawlessly, over and over, until his body moves without conscious thought. The heavy wooden sword becomes an extension of his arm. The small shield, an extension of his will. The psychological component of this training is immense. The trainers are not just building muscle. They are building a specific mindset. Lyros is being trained to be an aggressor. The Threx was a crowd-pleasing type known for his agility and his relentless attacks. He is taught to be ferocious, to press his advantage, to give the crowd the spectacle of violence they crave. Any sign of hesitation or fear is beaten out of him. Spends hours wearing the full weight of his training armor, which, like the weapons, is heavier than the real thing. The greaves protecting his shins are heavy, the crested helmet a crushing weight on his neck and shoulders. He must perform his complex footwork and attack drills under this immense load, building a level of endurance that is almost superhuman. The sweat pours from his body, soaking the sand at his feet, but he is not allowed to stop. At the end of each day, his body is a symphony of pain. Not the generalized ache of the initial conditioning, but a specific, focused pain. The muscles in his wrist and forearm burn from the strange torque of the curved psyche. His legs and hips ache from the constant low stance and the shuffling footwork. His neck is a knot of tension from the weight of the helmet. It is a pain that tells him his body is changing, adapting, becoming the body of a Threx. The physical toll of the specialized training was immense, but it was a predictable mechanical pain. A far greater terror was introduced when, after weeks of hitting the inanimate Palus, the day came when the recruits were finally allowed to spar against each other. This was a significant and terrifying rite of passage, the first time their skills would be tested against a living, thinking opponent who was just as desperate as they were. They did not fight to the death. That was a waste of the Lanesta's valuable property. But the bouts were far from gentle. They still used the heavy, blunted training weapons, the arma lusoria. But a blow from a weighted wooden sword could easily break a rib or a jaw, and a punch from a wicker shield's edge could split a man's lip open. The goal was not to kill, but to dominate, to subdue, to prove one's superiority. Lyros was pitted against a large, brutish recruit being trained as a murmillo, a heavily armed gladiator. It was a classic matchup. The smaller, more agile Threx against the powerful, heavily defended murmillo. As they circled each other in the center of the training yard, a ring of other gladiators formed around them, their voices a low, guttural hum of shouts and wagers. The watchful, critical eyes of the lanista and the doctors were upon them, judging their every move. The feeling was completely different from hitting the post. His opponent was alive, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and aggression. He was unpredictable. The fear in Lyros's gut was a cold, sharp presence. His first few movements were clumsy, purely defensive. As he absorbed the powerful blows of the murmillo on his small Parma shield, the impact sending jarring shocks up his arm. The crowd of gladiators jeered at his defensiveness. But then something shifted within him. The endless hours of drilling, the thousands of repetitive movements that his doctor had beaten into him, took over. His mind went quiet, and his body began to move on pure, ingrained instinct. He saw an opening. The murmillo, in his haste to land a decisive blow, swung his heavy sword in a wide, clumsy arc. Lyros, without thinking, ducked under the blow, his body moving with a speed and agility he didn't know he possessed. He used the hook of his curved sekka to get around the German S-large shield and delivered a sharp, painful blow to the back of his opponent's exposed knee. The big man roared in pain and stumbled. The crowd's jeering turned to a murmur of interest. The fight was over a moment later. Lyros had not won through brute strength, but through the brutal, efficient science that had been drilled into his very soul. The aftermath of these sparring sessions was a strange and cruel paradox. The yard would be littered with men nursing injuries, bruised ribs, split lips, dislocated shoulders, they would be dragged, groaning, to the valetudinarium, the school's infirmary. Here, a different kind of professional took over. The Medici, the doctors employed by the lanista, were often highly skilled physicians, some of the best in the Roman world. Lyros, his own shoulder aching from a particularly vicious shield bash, was sent to the infirmary. The space was surprisingly clean and organized, a stark contrast to the filth of the barracks. The air smelled of medicinal herbs, vinegar, and clean linen. He watched as a doctor, a quiet, focused Greek man, expertly set the broken arm of another trainee. The man's screams muffled by a leather strap he had been given to bite down on. When it was his turn, the doctor examined his shoulder with gentle, professional hands. He applied a soothing, cool poultice of herbs to the deep bruise and wrapped it in a clean linen bandage. The care was meticulous, the touch surprisingly gentle. It was a moment of almost surreal kindness in a world that was defined by brutality, which his care was not born of compassion. The gladiators were an incredibly expensive investment, a stable of prize animals. A dead or permanently maimed trainee was a complete financial loss for the lanista. A skilled doctor was as essential to the business as a good trainer. He was there to protect the property, to patch up the valuable assets, and get them ready for the next day's brutal training, for the ultimate purpose of their existence, the arena. So Lyros found himself in a bizarre daily routine. In the morning, he would be systematically and brutally beaten by his doctor in the training yard. In the afternoon, he would be meticulously and gently patched up by another kind of doctor in the infirmary. It was a surreal cycle of violence and healing, a system designed to keep his body in a perpetual state of readiness for the bloody spectacle that awaited him. As months of this brutal routine ground on, the initial chaotic mass of recruits was slowly forged into a hardened, disciplined community. A strange and complex social order began to form within the walls of the ludus. Lyros learned that not all gladiators were equal. There was a clear hierarchy based on fighting style, experience, and success in the arena. The established fighters, the veterans who had survived multiple combats, carried themselves with a grim, dangerous confidence. They received better food, better equipment, and the respect of the trainers. The new recruits, the tyrones, were at the very bottom, subject to the whims and abuse of everyone else. Lyros, having proven his competence in the sparring sessions, slowly began to earn a sliver of respect, a small foothold in this brutal new world. Intense rivalries existed between the different classes of gladiators. The heavily armed Myrmilones, with their great shields and swords, looked down on the nimble retieri, with their nets and tridents, seeing them as tricksters rather than true warriors. These rivalries were encouraged by the lanista, as they made for more passionate and entertaining fights in the arena. Yet, in this dark and violent world, strange and powerful bonds of friendship could also form. These were the men who shared the same cell, the same food, the same beatings. They understood each other's fears and desperation in a way that no one on the outside ever could. Lyros formed a quiet, unspoken bond with the silent criminal who shared his cell. They would share their meager rations, help each other clean their gear, and stand together against the bullies of the barracks. They knew that one day they might be forced to kill each other in the sand of the arena. But for now, in the shared misery of the ludus, they were brothers. The shadow of the arena loomed over every moment of their existence. Every drill, every meal, every waking hour was a preparation for a moment of public slaughter. This knowledge was a constant heavy weight on the soul. Lyros saw how it affected the men in different ways. Some, like the big German, embraced the violence. They became arrogant and cruel, finding their identity in their ability to dominate others. They were the ones who would likely thrive in the arena.
Oh.
Others fell into a deep, quiet despair. They would go through the motions of training, their eyes vacant and hopeless. These men, Lyros learned, usually did not last long, would either die in their first fight or take their own lives in the darkness of their cells. Lyros chose a third path, a path of quiet, stoic resolve. He focused only on his training, on perfecting his skills, on the simple day-to-day mechanics of survival. He walled off his emotions, his fear, and his memories of his past life. It was the only way to stay sane. Finally, after nearly a year of this relentless process, the lanista deemed him ready. One evening, the entire school was assembled in the main courtyard. The lanista stood on a raised platform, a scroll in his hand. A dead silence fell over the men. This was the moment of selection, the day the list of fighters for the upcoming games was announced. The lanista began to read the names, his voice cold and businesslike. With each name, a man would either straighten his back with a mixture of pride and terror, or slump his shoulders in a moment of temporary, blessed relief. The air was thick with a tension that was almost unbearable. Then he heard his own name called, Lyros, the Thracian. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Cold dread washed over him, followed by a strange, hot surge of adrenaline. This was it. The training was over. His purpose, the one that had been beaten into him for a year, was about to be fulfilled. He was no longer a trainee. He was now a gladiator, a man destined for the sand. He was separated from the main group along with the other chosen fighters. They were taken to a different, cleaner section of the barracks, a place for the active combatants. The food was better, the conditions slightly more comfortable. They were now the lanista's prize assets, and they needed to be in peak condition for the show. But it was not a place of honor. It was a holding pen, a place where men waited to either die or to kill. That night, Lyros lay in his new, slightly less wretched cell. He could hear the distant sounds of the city, the laughter and the music, a world that he was no longer a part of. He was a gladiator now. His training, his brutal and systematic dehumanization, was complete. He had been forged into a weapon. And in a few days, in the sand of the arena, in front of the roaring mob, he would finally be put to the test. Now that he was a combatant, chosen for the games, Lyros's life in the ludus changed. He was moved from the squalid, crowded cells of the trainees to a different barracks block, a place reserved for the active fighters. The change was palpable. The cells were slightly larger, cleaner, and each man had his own straw pallet. He was no longer a worthless recruit. He was a valuable asset, a piece of the lanista's property that was about to be put on the market. The food also improved. The monotonous, fattening barley mash was now supplemented with higher quality protein, beans, lentils, and on rare occasions small portions of goat meat. This was not an act of kindness. It was a calculated business decision. A well-fed gladiator had more stamina, more strength, and would put on a better, longer, and more profitable show in the arena. Every aspect of his existence was now fine-tuned for his impending performance. But this improvement in physical conditions came with a new and far heavier psychological burden. As a trainee, His only goal was to survive the next drill, the next beating. Now he lived with the constant, cold knowledge of his own scheduled death. The upcoming games were not an abstract concept. They were a fixed point in time, towards which his life was now hurtling. He saw this pressure affect the other chosen fighters in different ways. Some became louder, their boasts and laughter echoing through the courtyard. A desperate, fragile bravado meant to mask their terror. Others withdrew completely, becoming silent. Brooding figures who would spend hours sharpening their swords, their faces grim and unreadable. A strange, fatalistic calm settled over this part of the school. These were men living on borrowed time, and they all knew it. Leros found himself in a state of heightened awareness. Every sensation was sharper, every sound clearer. He would watch the way the sunlight fell across the dusty training yard, the intricate patterns of a spider's web in the corner of his cell, the way the muscles moved under the skin of another gladiator as he trained. It was as if his body, knowing its time might be short, was trying to absorb every last detail of the world. The social order in this new barracks was also different. Here the hierarchy was absolute, based on one thing only: survival. At the top were the veterani, the veterans who had fought and survived multiple times in the arena. They were the kings of the ludus. They received the best food, the best equipment, and the deference of everyone, including the trainers. Some, the superstars known as primi pali, had even won their freedom and now worked as doctors themselves. These veterans were living proof that survival was possible, but they were also terrifying figures. Their bodies were covered in a latticework of old scars, each one a testament to a moment when they had stood at the very edge of death. They moved with a quiet, dangerous confidence, their eyes holding a deep, weary knowledge that the new fighters like Leros could not yet comprehend. Leros learned that the rivalries between the different gladiator classes were even more intense here. The men were not just training, they were studying their potential opponents. Threats like Leros would spend hours watching the Myrmilones train, noting their weaknesses. The way they held their shields, the rhythm of their footwork. It was a cold, analytical process, the study of how to kill. The training itself changed. It was no longer about general conditioning. It was about specific preparation for the upcoming opponents. Leros' doctor would drill him for hours on the specific techniques needed to defeat a heavily armed but slower fighter. He was taught to be a whirlwind of motion, to use his speed and the hooking curve of his Sika to find the gaps in his opponent's armor. The training was more focused, more intense, and more deadly than ever before. Every session was now a dress rehearsal for the real thing. In this strange, heightened state of waiting, the relationships between the gladiators became the most important thing in the world. They were a bizarre and contradictory mix of intense rivalry and profound brotherhood. These were the only other men who understood the unique hell of their existence. And this shared grim reality forged bonds that were, in some ways, stronger than family. They were the brotherhood of the damned. Leros saw this most clearly in his relationship with his cellmate, a silent, brooding man named Crixus, a criminal condemned to the arena for piracy. For months they had shared their tiny, dark cell with barely a word spoken between them. But in the weeks leading up to the games, a quiet, unspoken understanding began to grow. One evening, after a particularly brutal sparring session where Crixus had taken a bad fall and dislocated his shoulder, Leros helped him back to their cell. The Medici had already reset the joint. A procedure that had left Crixus pale and shaking with pain, but they had offered no other comfort. Leros took a strip of his own spare tunic, soaked it in precious cool water, and gently placed it on his cellmate's forehead. It was a small, simple act of compassion, but in the brutal world of the ludus, it was a profound gesture. Crixus looked at him, and for the first time, Leros saw something other than grim silence in the man's eyes. He saw a flicker of gratitude. "They will put us against each other, you know," Crixus whispered, his voice hoarse with pain. "One day," "I know," Leros replied, his own voice quiet. "Then I will try to give you a clean death, and you will do the same for me." It was the most honest and intimate conversation he had had in a year. They both knew that their friendship was a temporary, fragile thing, that it would likely end in a spray of blood on the hot sand. But for now, in the shared darkness of their cell, they were brothers. The veteran gladiators, the ones who had survived, also played a complex role. They were not kind, but they were sometimes sources of grim, practical wisdom. One evening, a famous veteran, a primus pales named Drusus, who had survived 20 fights, gathered the new combatants, including Leros. He did not offer them words of encouragement. He gave them a lesson in survival. "The crowd is a beast," Drusus said, his voice a low growl. "It does not care if you are brave or if you are afraid. It only cares if you are entertaining. If you find yourself disarmed, on your back, with a blade at your throat, do not beg, do not cry. It is a pathetic sight, and the crowd hates weakness. Look them in the eye," he continued, his gaze passing over each of the terrified young men. "Look at the editor of the games," raise one finger. "Show no fear. Show that you are a true gladiator, worthy of their respect. They might spare you. They probably won't. But you will die well. In this life, that is the only victory you can control." This was the cold, hard currency of their world. Not life, but the manner of one's death. The men clung to these small moments of shared humanity. In the flickering lamplight of their cells at night, they would play games of dice. The quiet rattle of the bones on the stone floor, a small, familiar sound in the tense silence. They would tell crude jokes, their laughter a brief, harsh bark of defiance against the despair that was always waiting at the edge of their minds. They took care of each other in small ways. A man might share a piece of fruit he had bought from a guard. Another might use his knowledge of herbs to create a poultice for a comrade's wound. These were not grand gestures. They were the tiny, almost invisible threads of community that they wove together to keep themselves from completely unraveling. When a man from their barracks was killed in the arena, a strange, somber mood would settle over the ludus. There was no formal ceremony, no mourning, but the men would be quieter that evening. A portion of the evening meal might be left untouched, a silent offering to the dead. They all knew that their own turn could be next. Each death was a reminder of their own mortality, a fresh crack in the fragile wall of denial. They all tried to build around themselves. The days leading up to the games were a strange mixture of intensified training and surreal ritual. The workouts became even more focused, tailored to the specific opponents each gladiator was scheduled to face. The doctors would push the men to the very edge of their endurance, sharpening their skills, honing their reflexes. Every training session was now a dress rehearsal for a performance where the slightest mistake would be the last. For the first time, Leros and the other new combatants were allowed to train with real steel weapons. The feel of the real Sika in his hand was a revelation. It was lighter than the weighted wooden practice sword, perfectly balanced and lethally sharp. The small, bronze-edged Parma shield felt nimble and alive on his arm. He practiced his moves with a new, deadly seriousness. These were no longer tools of training. They were the instruments of his survival. Their armor was brought out from the stores, each piece polished to a high gleam. The armor was designed not just for protection, but for spectacle. The bronze of Lyros's Thracian helmet, with its ornate griffin crest, shone like gold in the sun. It was all part of the show, the creation of a larger-than-life character for the crowd to either love or hate. The night before the games, the gladiators were given the traditional cena libera, the free feast. It was a bizarre and deeply unsettling event. The chosen fighters were led from their cells to a large decorated hall. Long tables were laden with a lavish banquet, a feast of a quality they had not seen in their entire lives. There were platters of roasted meats, bowls of exotic fruits, fine breads, an endless amphory of rich, dark wine. This was not an act of kindness. It was a business transaction. The public was often allowed to attend this final meal, to walk among the tables and inspect the human merchandise they would be betting on the next day. Wealthy patrons would stare at the gladiators, assessing their muscles, their scars, their fighting spirit. It was a final, profound humiliation to be gawked at like a prize bull on the eve of its slaughter. The atmosphere at the feast was thick with a strange mixture of gallows humor and profound silent terror. Some men, like the big German, gorged themselves with a desperate manic energy, laughing loudly and drinking heavily, trying to drown their fear in a final blaze of indulgence. Others sat in stoic silence, their faces grim, methodically eating to build their strength for the ordeal to come. A few, the youngest and most terrified, were unable to eat at all, their faces pale, their eyes wide with the horror of what awaited them at dawn. Liros ate slowly, deliberately. He ate the roasted pork, the sweet dates, and drank the rich wine. He focused on the flavors, on the sensation of a full belly, trying to anchor himself in this one last moment of physical pleasure. He knew that this feast was a calculated cruelty, a final taste of a life he would never have, meant to make the prospect of death all the more bitter. The next morning came far too soon. The men were woken in the dark, but there was no shouting, no whips. A somber, almost reverent, quiet had settled over the ludus. They were given a final simple meal. Then the preparations began. Their bodies were scraped clean, massaged with fine oils until their muscles shone, a process that felt disturbingly like the preparation of a sacrificial animal. Then they began to don their real combat armor. Not the gaudy parade armor, but the functional, deadly steel and bronze they would wear in the arena. Lyros's doctor helped him fit his greaves, his armored belt, and finally, his heavy, enclosing helmet. As the helmet was lowered over his head, the world became a dark, muffled, and claustrophobic space. His vision was reduced to a narrow slit. His own breathing was a loud, ragged sound in his ears. He was now a gladiator. The final act before leaving for the arena was the Pampa, the grand parade through the city streets. The gladiators were marched out of the gates of the ludus, their new armor gleaming, and into the roaring chaos of the city. The streets were packed with a noisy, jostling mob, all eager to see the performers of the day's bloody spectacle. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wave of sound that washed over him. The air was thick with the smell of the city of street food, of unwashed bodies, of animals. The crowd would cheer for their favorites and hurl insults and garbage at the others, flowers would be thrown, along with curses. Lyros marched in the procession, his face a hard, emotionless mask, his eyes fixed straight ahead. He was an object on display, a piece of meat being paraded before the feast. He could feel the thousands of eyes on him, and he understood, in that moment, that he was no longer a person. He was a story, a spectacle, a sacrifice for the entertainment of the Roman people. The grand parade, the Pampa, ends at the massive arched entrance to the amphitheater. The roar of the crowd, which had been a diffuse citywide noise, now becomes a focused, deafening wave of sound that seems to shake the very ground. The gladiators are not led up into the stands, but are herded down a steep, dark, and narrow ramp, a path that leads into the guts of the great stone beast. The transition is jarring. They move from the bright sunlight and the open air into a dark, subterranean world of stone corridors and flickering torchlight. The temperature drops immediately, the air becoming cool, damp, and heavy with a cocktail of terrifying smells. The pungent animal scent of the beast pens where lions and bears paced in their cages, the sharp, coppery smell of old blood that seemed to have soaked into the very earth of the floor, and the overwhelming human stench of unwashed bodies and pure, unadulterated fear. This was the Karzer, the warren of holding cells and tunnels that lay beneath the arena floor. This was where the condemned waited for their execution, where the wild animals were kept, and where the gladiators spent their final moments before a fight. It was a place of profound and absolute dread. Lyros and the other fighters are shoved into a large communal holding cell. The only light comes from a single high-graded opening that leads up to the arena floor. Through this grate, they can hear the sounds of the spectacle above, the constant, deafening roar of tens of thousands of spectators, a sound like the ocean in a storm. It's a blast of trumpets, signaling the start of the morning's entertainments. And, most terrifyingly, the savage roars of lions and the screams of men. As the public executions and animal hunts, the Venatians, took place. For hours, they are left to wait in this dim, foul-smelling space. The bravado and the gallows humor of the feast are gone, replaced by a thick, heavy silence. The men sit on the stone benches that line the walls, each one lost in his own private hell. Some close their eyes and seem to meditate, their faces stoic masks. Others stare into the middle distance, their eyes wide and unblinking. A few tremble uncontrollably, their bodies betraying the terror their minds are trying to suppress. This waiting is perhaps the cruelest part of the entire ordeal. It is a long, slow, and agonizing torture of the mind. Every roar from the crowd above is a reminder of the violent spectacle that awaits them. Every scream is a premonition of their own possible fate. There is nothing to do but sit, listen, and wait for your name to be called. Lyros sits beside his cellmate, Crixus. The silent criminal, who had seemed so unbreakable, now has a fine sheen of sweat on his brow. They do not speak for a long time. Then Crixus turns to him. "If I fall," he says, his voice a low, rough whisper, "and you survive, take my share of the winnings. Send it to my sister in Brundisium. Her name is Livia."
Oh.
He gives Lyros the name of a tavern owner who can find her.
Oh.
It is a simple, practical request, a final act of a man putting his affairs in order. It is an acknowledgement that he does not expect to survive the day. Lyros feels a lump in his throat. "I will," he says, "and you will do the same for me." They clasped forearms for a brief, powerful moment, a final gesture of their strange and grim brotherhood. Finally, after what feels like a lifetime, the sounds from the arena above begin to change. The animal roars and the screams of the condemned fade, replaced by a new, more expectant buzz from the crowd. The midday sun streams through the grate, a sign that the main event, the gladiatorial combats, are about to begin. A guard, his armor gleaming in the torchlight, unbolts the heavy door to their cell. He holds a list. A dead silence falls as he begins to read the names of the first pair to fight. 2 men, a retiarius and a secutor, stand up, their faces pale. They are led out of the cell and down a dark corridor. The process is repeated. With each pair of names, the tension in the room ratchets up. Finally, the guard's eyes find Lyros. Lyros, the Thracian, he calls out, his voice devoid of emotion. Against Vulcanus, the Murmillo. A cold electric shock runs through Lyros's body.
Ow.
He gets to his feet, his legs feeling strangely numb. He is led from the cell into a small antechamber, where his doctor and an armor slave are waiting. They help him don his final pieces of combat armor, their movements quick and professional. His doctor leans in close, his final words of advice a harsh whisper. He is slow. Use your speed. Stay on the outside. Tire him out. And for the God's sake, give the crowd a good show. He is given his shield and his sharp steel sika. He walks down a long, dark, and upward-sloping tunnel. He can hear the roar of the crowd growing louder with every step, a deafening, inhuman sound. He can smell the hot, dry sand of the arena floor. Reaches a heavy, grated gate at the end of the tunnel. He stands there, his heart hammering in his chest, his breath a ragged sound in the confines of his helmet. This is it, the culmination of a year of pain, of training, of brutalization. He is a piece of meat about to be thrown to the lions of public opinion. The gate groans as it begins to open, and a rectangle of blinding, brilliant sunlight appears before him. He takes one last deep breath and steps out of the darkness into the light and the deafening roar of the arena. The grate of the heavy iron gate being dragged open is a deafening final sound. It is the sound of a cage opening. A rectangle of blinding, brilliant sunlight appears before Lyros. Stark contrast to the dim, torchlit tunnel he has been waiting in. He takes one last deep breath, the air in his lungs feeling hot and thin in the confines of his helmet. He steps out of the darkness and into the arena. The first thing that hits him is the sensory assault. After the cool, damp quiet of the subterranean cells, the arena is a furnace of light, sound, and smell. The sun beats down with a ferocious intensity, reflecting off the white sand of the arena floor with a blinding glare. The heat is a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket, and then there is the sound. It is not just a noise. It is a physical force that seems to press in on him from all sides, a deafening, continuous roar from the tens of thousands of spectators packed into the great stone amphitheater. It is a sound of bloodlust, of excitement, of a mob hungry for a spectacle. It is the sound of the beast he is here to entertain. The air smells of hot sand, of sweat, of the pungent metallic scent of old blood that the sand can never fully absorb, and of the sweet, cloying perfume that is sprayed over the crowd to mask the stench of death. It is the smell of the circus, the smell of his new reality. He and the other gladiators who were to fight in the first half of the day's games march onto the sand. This is the Pampa, the opening parade. They walk a slow, solemn lap of the arena, their polished combat armor gleaming in the sun. They are a display of the Lanista's finest wares, their bodies and weapons on show for the crowd to admire and to judge. They halt before the ornate shaded box where the editor, the wealthy magistrate who is sponsoring the games, is seated. In perfect, drilled unison, they raise their right arms in a salute. A single, powerful voice, that of the veteran Drusus, calls out the famous, chilling words, and the others join in, their voices a deep, resonant chorus of the damned. Avenue, Imperator, Morituri, Te Salutin, Tail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. A blast of trumpets signals the start of the games. A referee checks their weapons, ensuring they are real and sharp. And then Lyros is alone on the sand, facing his opponent. It is Valcanus, the massive mermello he had seen in training, a man who seemed to be carved from a block of solid muscle. His great rectangular shield is like a moving wall, and his helmet, with its high and light crest, completely conceals his face, making him seem like an inhuman bronze monster. The psychological tension of this moment is the true first battle. Lyros's heart hammers against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the roar of the crowd. His mouth is dry, his palms are slick with sweat inside his leather grips. Every instinct in his body is screaming at him to run, to flee. But his training, the months of brutal, repetitive drilling, takes over. He forces his body into the familiar stance of the Threx, his small Parma shield held high, his curved Sekka ready. He focuses on his opponent, trying to shut out the overwhelming noise of the crowd. He watches the way Vulcanus moves, the way he holds his shield, the rhythm of his breathing. The world shrinks until it contains only two people, himself and the man he must kill or be killed by. The trumpet sounds again, the signal to begin. The fight does not start with a wild, heroic charge. It begins slowly, cautiously. The two men circle each other on the hot sand, a deadly, probing dance. The sound of their hobnailed sandals crunching on the sand is the only noise in a world that has suddenly become focused on their every move. The crowd watches in a state of rapt, expectant silence. This is the moment they have been waiting for. Vulcanus, the Murmillo, makes the first move. He does not charge wildly, advances with a slow, grinding, and terrifying deliberation, his huge rectangular shield held before him like a moving wall. His short, straight sword, the gladius, held low and ready. The only part of him visible is his powerful, greave-protected legs and a sliver of darkness behind the grill of his helmet. He is a walking fortress of bronze and iron. Lyros circles him, his body low, his movements quick and fluid. Just as his doctor had taught him, he is the smaller, faster animal, the wolf circling the bear. Must rely on his speed and his agility because he knows that a single, direct blow from the Murmillo could shatter his arm or crush his ribs, even through his armor. The first clash of weapons is a sharp, percussive clang that seems to momentarily silence the great crowd. Vulcanus thrusts, a simple, brutal, legionary-style stab. Lyros parries with his small Parma shield, the impact a jarring shock that runs up his entire arm. He immediately counters, his curved Sika hooking around the edge of the Murmillo's great shield, searching for an opening. The steel scrapes against the bronze rim of the shield with a high-pitched screech. The fight falls into a grim rhythm. Vulcanus is the aggressor, constantly pressing forward. his immense strength and superior defense forcing Lyros to give ground. He uses his great shield as a battering ram, trying to knock Lyros off balance. Lyros is in a state of constant defensive motion, his feet shuffling in the hot sand, his body a blur of dodges and parries. It is exhausting work, a desperate dance on the edge of a razor. From inside his helmet, the world is a claustrophobic hell. The roar of the crowd is a distant, muffled, inhuman sound, like the roar of the sea. The only sounds that are clear and immediate are the sharp clang of steel on steel, the heavy thud of a weapon on his shield, and the sound of his own ragged, desperate breathing, hot and stale in the enclosed space. Sweat pours down his face, stinging his eyes, but he cannot wipe it away. His vision is a narrow, horizontal slit, a tiny window onto a world that is trying to kill him. The sun is a relentless, punishing force. The sand of the arena floor reflects the heat upwards, and his bronze helmet becomes a suffocating oven. He can feel the heat of the metal through the thick padding inside. His body is drenched in sweat, his leather straps slick and uncomfortable against his skin. The sheer physical exertion of fighting in 50 pounds of armor under the noon sun is a battle in itself. He takes his first wound. In a moment of misjudgment, he fails to fully parry a blow. The tip of Vulcanus's gladius scrapes along his thigh, cutting through his padded garment and slicing a shallow but instantly bloody gash in his leg. The pain is a sharp, clean fire. It is the first time he has been cut by real steel. The sight of his own blood, and the roar of approval from the crowd at the sight of it, sends a fresh wave of cold fear through him. He now understands that he is not just a fighter, he is a performer. The crowd is a thirsty beast, and it demands blood. A boring, overly defensive fight could turn the mob against both of them. He knows he has to take risks, to be aggressive, to give them the spectacle they paid for. His survival depends not just on his skill, but on his ability to be entertaining in his violence. He changes his tactic. Instead of just retreating, he begins to use his agility to his advantage. He feints to the left, and as the great Murmillo moves his heavy shield to block, Lyros quickly sidesteps to the right, his movements light and fast. For a split second, the Murmillo's side is exposed. It is the opening he has been waiting for, the one his doctor had drilled into him 1,000 times against the post. He lunges, his curved Sika flashing in the sun. He does not aim for the armor, but for the gap beneath the armpit. He feels the blade bite deep. Vulcanus lets out a great roaring cry, a sound of pure animal pain, and stumbles back, his own blood now staining the sand. Lyros does not press his attack. He retreats, his heart hammering, his lungs burning. He has wounded the beast. But he can see the look in the dark slit of his opponent's helmet. The professional indifference is gone, replaced by a new and terrifying fury. The fight is not over. The blood has only just begun to flow. The sight of his own blood enraged the Murmillo. Vulcanus let out a great bellowing roar, a sound of pure animal fury, and charged. His previous caution was gone, replaced by a reckless, powerful assault. He swung his heavy gladius in wide, brutal arcs, each blow powerful enough to shatter bone. Lyros was forced into a desperate, retreating defense, his small Parma shield barely able to withstand the onslaught. The crowd roared its approval. This was the savagery they had come to see. Lyros knew he could not survive a direct strength-for-strength confrontation with the larger man. He had to rely on his training, on his speed, on his wits. He focused not on the sword, but on his opponent's feet. He watched the Murmillo's clumsy, enraged footwork, waiting for the inevitable mistake. It came. In his fury, Vulcanus put all his weight into a massive overhead swing, a move designed to split Lyros's shield in two. Ow! It was a powerful but slow and telegraphed attack. At the last possible second, Lyros sidestepped, letting the Murmillo's sword crash into the empty sand where he had just been standing. The big man was now overextended, his balance compromised for a split second. It was the opening Lyros had been trained to look for. Moved with a speed he did not know he possessed. He did not attack the man, but the man's foundation. He hooked his leg behind Vulcanus's ankle and pushed with all his might against the big man's shield. With a great grunting cry, the massive Murmillo, his balance lost, crashed backwards onto the hot sand with a thunderous clang of armor. Lyros was on him in an instant. The sharp point of his steel sika pressed against his opponent's throat. The fight was over. A deafening roar erupted from the crowd. Vulcanus's chest heaving, looked up at Lyros from behind the grill of his helmet. He was defeated. Then he did the only thing he could do. He let his sword and shield fall to the sand and raised a single, trembling finger. It was the ad digitum, the traditional sign of surrender, an appeal for mercy. It was not an appeal to Lyros, but to the true masters of his fate, the crowd and the editor of the games. A new kind of silence fell over the arena, the expectant hush of a crowd that knows it now holds the power of life and death. Lyros stood over his defeated opponent, his own body screaming with pain and exhaustion, his blood dripping onto the sand. He looked up, past the body of Vulcanus, and into the sea of thousands of faces that packed the amphitheater. He saw them all, the wealthy and the poor, the men and the women, their faces alight with a morbid excitement. They began to gesture with their thumbs. The exact historical gesture is debated, but the meaning was clear. For a moment it was a mixture. Some, perhaps impressed by the Murmillo's strength, gestured for him to be spared. But the majority, thrilled by the bloody fight and the dramatic conclusion, turned their thumbs down, a signal for death. Lyros's gaze shifted to the editor's box. The wealthy magistrate who had sponsored the games was watching the crowd, a small smile on his face. He was a politician, and he knew which way the wind blew. He let the tension build for a long, dramatic moment. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he too gave the signal, thumbs down. A great unified roar of approval went up from the crowd. The sentence had been passed. Vulcanus, lying on the sand, let out a single, ragged sigh of resignation. He knew the rules. He had lived by them, and now he would die by them. He made no sound. He simply offered his neck, a final grim act of professional courage. Lyros stood there, his sword held in a trembling hand. This was the moment his entire training had led to, but it was not what he had expected. To kill a man in the heat of battle was one thing. To execute a helpless, defeated opponent in cold blood was another. He looked down at the man, a fellow prisoner of the ludus, a man with whom he had shared the same tasteless food and the same brutal discipline. He could hear his doctor's voice in his head. Give the crowd a good show. He could feel the thousands of eyes on him, waiting, expectant. To hesitate now would be to show weakness, to displease the crowd and the editor. It would be a black mark on his own, fragile chance for survival. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, the image of his family's farm flashing through his mind. Then he opened them. They were cold and empty. He raised his Sika high, its polished steel glinting in the sun, and with a single, swift, and brutally efficient movement, just as he had been trained to do 1,000 times against the post, he drove the blade into his opponent's neck. A deafening, unified roar of approval goes up from the crowd. The sentence has been carried out. Lyros stands over the body of his opponent, his chest heaving, his own blood and the blood of Valcanus mingling on his skin and armor. The noise of the crowd is a physical force, a wave of sound that washes over him, but he feels strangely detached from it, as if he is watching the scene from a great distance. A referee in a white tunic approaches and raises Lyros's arm high in the air, declaring him the victor. Another official presents him with the palma, the palm frond of victory, a symbolic prize. A small heavy purse of prize money is also pressed into his hand. He has won. He has survived. But as he looks down at the still form of the Murmillo, a man he had almost come to respect in the shared misery of the ludus, he feels no triumph. There is only a profound, hollow emptiness, a cold numbness that seems to extinguish the hot fire of the arena. He is led from the arena, his armor feeling impossibly heavy. As he walks back down the dark tunnel, he passes a group of arena slaves, the Libitinari, dressed as the underworld god Charon, their faces hidden by grotesque masks. They are heading onto the sand with a large stretcher to drag away the body of Volcanos. They will sprinkle fresh, clean sand over the dark, bloody patch to make the arena ready for the next combat. The show must go on. His return to the ludus is different from any other day. The other gladiators, the trainees, and the veterans look at him with a new expression. It is a mixture of respect, envy, and a certain grim understanding. He is no longer a tyro, a recruit. He has faced the sand and the steel, and he has survived. He is now a veteranus, a true gladiator, a member of their grim fraternity. He is taken to the infirmary, where the Greek doctor meticulously cleans and stitches the gash on his leg. The treatment is even more careful than before. He is a proven asset now, a fighter who can win, a valuable piece of property who must be maintained. After his wound is dressed, he is assigned a new cell in the barracks block reserved for the veteran fighters. It is slightly larger, slightly cleaner. It is a small reward for the life he has just taken. Here the days that follow fall into a new, yet familiar routine. The training is just as relentless, but it is different. He is now a seasoned combatant. He spars with other veterans, their bouts a deadly high-speed chess match of skill and experience. He is given better food, a diet richer in meat and vegetables, designed to build the strong, lean muscle of a professional athlete. He has money now, more than he has ever had in his life. He can use it to buy better food from the camp market, a bottle of real wine, or the companionship of the women who lived in the shadow of the ludus. These are the small, fleeting pleasures that make his grim existence bearable. He has even achieved a strange, morbid form of fame. The children of Capua whisper his name, Lyros the Thracian, and the gamblers study his form, placing their bets on his next victory. But despite these superficial changes, his fundamental reality is the same. He is still a prisoner. He is still the property of the lanista. His life is still not his own. His victories in the arena have not earned him his freedom. They have only made him more valuable, a more profitable investment that the lanista will be sure to protect and to use until he is no longer profitable. The proof of this comes a few weeks after his first fight. His wound is barely healed, but he is roused one morning and led back to the training yard. His doctor is waiting for him, a heavy wooden practice sword in his hand. The training begins again. The endless drills against the payless, the grueling physical conditioning, the brutal sparring. The cycle starts anew. He is being prepared for his next fight, and the one after that, and the one after that. The segment of his life as a captured warrior is over. The boy who was sold in the slave market is gone. The terrified recruit who entered the ludus has been burned away. All that remains is the gladiator. He has survived his first day in the school and his first day in the arena. But he now understands the terrible truth of his existence. His life is now an endless, bloody cycle of training and combat. A life lived on the edge of a sword until the day comes when he is not fast enough, or strong enough, or lucky enough. A day when it will be his body that is dragged from the sand. And so, the story of Leros the Thracian comes to a close. His is a story of survival in a world of calculated brutality. A story written not in histories of glory, but in the scars on a man's body and the grim acceptance in his eyes. He was a prisoner, a slave, and an entertainer, his life a commodity to be bought and sold for the pleasure of the mob. The great arenas of Rome were built not just with stone and sand, but with the blood and fear of countless men like him, their names and stories lost to time. Their long fight is over. The roar of the crowd has faded. And now, your journey for tonight can come to a peaceful close as well. There are no more battles to fight, no more crowds to please. There is only the quiet of this moment. Let the story fade and allow your mind to drift into a deep and well-deserved rest. Sleep well.